Welcome to Maneuvering Music, a vocal music podcast based at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. My name is Carrie Sullivan, and I am pleased to be your host for today's episode. Today's episode will be a little different. It is our first ever Project Spotlight. Recently, previous podcast guests Nate Wilkins and Maddie Fitzpatrick have collaborated with composer and Miami professor Dr. Phil Roberts to create a series of recordings and music videos of Dr. Roberts' composition Iteru. The song cycle for soprano is entirely in ancient Egyptian and tells the story of death, birth, and celebration. Now let's go talk to Nate, Maddie, and Phil about their project, listen to the music, and see just how incredible it is. All right, so we've made it to the main segment of today's episode, and as I mentioned in my introduction, we're going to be doing a project spotlight today on a song cycle in ancient Egyptian titled Iteru, written by the one and only Dr. Philip Roberts, who we have on this episode today. We're so fortunate to have him, as well as Maddie Fitzpatrick and Nate Wilkins reappearing for their second Maneuvering Music episode. So I'd just like to give everybody a few seconds to sort of introduce themselves to the audience. So I'll go ahead and start with you, Dr. Roberts, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, I'm Phil Roberts, and I'm the composer of Iteru, which translates to On the Nile, a song cycle for piano and soprano that also exists in an orchestrated form for harp, cello, violin, alto flute, English horn, and, of course, the soprano.
Awesome. Who wants to go next?
I'll go. Hi, I'm Maddie Fitzpatrick. I am the soprano that got the privilege to perform the Iteru. I got to perform it and record it with Nate. It was a really cool experience, and over the summer I also got to take an Egyptology course, which helped me a lot to understand and decipher all of the cool aspects of the piece.
Yes, Maddie really knows her stuff about ancient Egypt. We just had a conversation a few hours ago. She knows everything there is to know, so I'm excited to pick her brain about this.
I don't think that's true, but
she knows more than
ramble.
me. Yes, of course. All right, Nate, your turn.
Hi, I'm Nate Wilkins, and while I'm traditionally a singer, in this project I acted as the cinematographer for this project. I was quarantining with Maddie, and so we had a lot of opportunity to find ways to capture classical music performances in ways that aren't often done, as forced by the whole COVID pandemic. So the goal for this project with me is just to act as a way to show that it can be done. You know, we can make music videos for classical art song and just put it out there, you know, see how it does.
And it did. It most certainly did. So,
Well, thank you, Carrie.
Awesome. Yes. So we talked a little bit, Phil talked a little bit about just sort of what the piece is and how it's orchestrated, but did you want to kind of tell us about the background of when you wrote it, why, sort of what the concept is, anything along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. A general overview is that this song cycle has 3 movements. So right now we're just giving a general overview, and then we'll probably delve into each movement individually, like Carrie was saying. But this is a project that has been a long time in coming. Ever since I was about 4 years old, I've been a little archaeologist, I guess you could say. I definitely learned to start reading and writing in hieroglyphics at that age, and it's something that I've continued to this day. And when I decided to write a song cycle for soprano, well, I looked at the breadth of music that's out there, And there's a lot of music written by composers in the classical canon on texts of monotheistic religions, like the Bible or the Quran or even the Torah. And so I decided to write a text on a polytheistic religion, which is the ancient Egyptian religion. And the texts are actually very beautiful. These predate a lot of the biblical texts, but they have a lot of similar themes. There's themes of rebirth. There are themes of the cycle of life. And so these are texts that really spoke to me, and I wanted to present them in their original language as best as possible. So I did a lot of research in composing this to ensure that I could give the singer some sort of pronunciation guide, even though, as I'm sure Maddie will go into, there's no exact, concise, correct pronunciation for the language. Most of it is somewhat based in conjecture, since obviously nobody's living that was alive in the time when ancient Egypt was a country. But if I can set the scene before we hear any of this music and talk about it today, just imagine being alive in the Middle Kingdom. That means the middle of the early and late and middle periods of ancient Egypt. There were 3 of them. And this is just a nation that was around for over 3,000 years. You could have been there, and 1,500 years before you, people were speaking this language and living this lifestyle. And 1,500 years later, people would still be part of this nation, part of this culture. And that's something that's almost inconceivable for us living in the United States, which has been around for not yet 300 years. So it's just really a culture that was all-encompassing. And in order for that to be the case, they must have been doing something right. And so this is what drew me to the project. And the forces, well, it's a lot easier to teach one singer to speak dead language than it is to teach an entire choir. So I chose a soprano for the singer for this. And Maddie has been a wonderful realizer of that part. And then the piano, because the piano has obviously a breadth of repertoire to it already, but it also has, in a grand piano, almost a harp on the inside of it, where you can play on the strings, which we'll get into when we talk about the second movement in the emulation of the ancient Egyptian harps.
All right.
All right.
Awesome. So let's dive right in then. Unless, Nate, did I cut you off? Did you want to say something?
Oh, I was going to talk a little bit about how Maddie got the music in the first place.
Yes, let's go over
Maddie
that.
happens to live in Boston, which is quite a ways away from Oxford, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
It actually turns out that Maddie and I were both attending Ames in the summer of 2019, I believe, at this point, which is in Austria, in Graz, and that's where we first met. And within, I want to say, 3 or 4 days of meeting each other, it was at like the first social gathering with food and drinks, right? Mm-hmm. She confided in me her interest in ancient Egyptian, and I remembered that Dr. Roberts had written a set in ancient Egyptian for soprano. And so I emailed Phil, and he sent me the score, and the rest was history. She was planning to perform it on her senior recital, but that never materialized due to COVID. And so it just seemed like a really nice thing to do while we were both cooped up together.
Absolutely. Also, just to throw this out there, my recital was going to originally be called Maddie in Denial. I just thought that was fun. And
That's so amazing.
something to throw out there.
That's the best thing I've ever heard. Absolutely love that. So, all right, without further ado, let's start at the beginning with the first movement. If I'm correct, if I did my research correctly, there are 5 movements in this piece, and Maddie has done the first 3. So those are the ones we're going to talk about because they pertain to the project. But the first movement, Tesherem Iteru, I talked about this a little bit with Maddie, but my general understanding of this piece is that it sort of talks about the plains of Aru, which is the afterlife that the ancient Egyptians believed in, where, you know, our idea of heaven, like for them, it was, you know, working in these plains and having, you know, infinite food and all of that, and that's just what they strive for in their life. So let's go ahead and talk about that. Whoever wants to pick up from that point.
I would let Maddie talk about the history, since she's actually our resident historical scholar.
Yes.
I don't know about that. Sure. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so in ancient Egypt, after you were, dead and mummified and put into your burial tomb, it was believed that after you died and all that happened, you had two parts of your soul called the Ka and the Ba. And the Ka would stay with your body, and that would receive all of the ceremonial offerings that people would come and bring. But the Ba is the one that would leave and go on this adventure into the Duat, which is part of the way to the afterlife, and the Book of the Dead, which is where we get most of the text from the Hieru Miteru, included all of these spells that you needed to get through the Duat, since the Duat was dangerous to mortals. There were gods that could eat you, there were monsters, demons, Apophis, which is a gigantic snake that is just chaos incarnate. But upon reaching the final destination in the Duat, you reach the Hall of Truths, which is probably what I usually think of when, or most people at least, in my opinion, when they think of ancient Egypt, which is Anubis with the scales, where you have that image of Anubis, and he has the feather on one scale and the heart on the other one, and Thoth is writing what the results are. But basically what's happening in that image is the soul or the Ba brings the heart that they left behind, and they weigh it against their 42 kind of like rules that they have, like the way that Christians have their 10 commandments. The ancient Egyptians had Mat, which is just 42 rules to live by. And do not kill, do not steal, do not be a bad person. So, and if your heart was lighter than this feather, then you would get to go to the plains of Iteru, which were a vastly different lifestyle than you would have in ancient Egypt, which was barren. You had to live off of the Nile, which would give you food, based off of the silt that it would produce when it flooded, or the little vegetation that it had, but also... it was the plains of Iteru were full of vegetation. They were full of life. They were walking with gods. They were walking with everyone that they loved in their lifetime, their old pets that they had that passed away, places that they had visited in their lifetime that they loved. And the only thing that they had to do was they had to reap the fields and the crops that they had to produce, because it was the gods' domain. So, yeah, that's kind of what's that is. Any questions?
Well, so what is the translation of the title then, or do you want me to talk about that?
The translation of the title, Teixeira Niteru, is Barley of the Nile, which talks about, it's a line in the text, so Sekana Ashtem Arua, which is, I have plowed all the forms of my existence. This line of the text talks about, I was kind of doing some work on this text, and I came to the conclusion that since farming was more of a male domain in Egyptian society, because work was divided to women territory and male territory, and farming definitely fell under male territory. And since this speaker had worked and plowed in all of the forms of his existence, he plowed in his life, and now he's plowing in afterlife. It's presumable that he's male. Moving to the next line. In my palm tree stands as the god Amsu over me. That would just be talking about how the gods are standing with you in the afterlife. They're all there, they're all present, and Amsu is Amun, who is the cult god that kind of, he picked up Middle Kingdom, and kept going until Akhenaten was weird in the New Kingdom, and then stopped being weird, and then anyway, that's different.
For some backup, Akhenaten made it monotheistic for a few years there.
He did, and then he stopped after his son Tutankhamun, who I'm sure you guys have heard of, made that not a thing anymore.
Right.
Good for him.
Yeah, and then he got hit by a chariot and wasn't king anymore. Anyway.
Yeah.
Is that how he died? I didn't know he died by being hit by a chariot. Wow.
Yeah, he got run over by a chariot.
Poor Tutankhamun.
okay.
Poor little King Tut.
Yeah, King Tut. Poor dude. Anyway, then it talks about the grain of my white bread is sacred, and my barley is from the Nile. My ale is from the barley of the Nile, which is interesting because it's actually bread and ale was really common in ancient Egypt, but the way that it's produced is sacred, I guess. White bread was not common at all. If you had bread, it was very like mixed grains and all that, but white bread was like, that's not a real thing. Like I'd read somewhere that white bread was very like used for people of higher status, and the barley of the Nile, I mean, the Nile's barley is just sacred in general because it's a sacred river. And then the last few lines of the text talk about the Sektet and Atet boat, which are the two barks that Ra takes during the day. Ra is the sun god. He rides a boat in the sky that carries the sun. And when he's in the sky, he takes two boats. So from dawn to noon, he takes the Matet or Atet boat. And then from noon to dusk, he takes the Sektet boat. And you can see, it's said, I read a couple places that you could see both of those boats from the plains of Aru. So it said in these texts that these two boats, they bring the food and the speaker eats them. So there's that. And the speaker is then under the familiar trees of which he knows. And that is just a quote that is for being someplace that he was enjoying, or maybe a tree that he liked in his lifetime that is now present in his afterlife with him. And it's just an overall pleasant afterlife experience, you know, because for a barren lifestyle in ancient Egypt, living off the Nile, trying to get food, and now having abundance and being under the protection of the gods and having everything you could want and more, it's pretty sweet.
Yeah, the 5-star hotel of eternity.
Yeah, something like that.
So.
It's a good way to
It's
put it.
better than having your heart eaten from Amit if your heart did not match up with the feather. So
Yep.
Absolutely, and it's a rather common sort of afterlife too. It also appears in Greek mythology with the Fields of Elysium.
Yeah.
It's a very similar sort of existence afterwards.
Good parallel. And if I'm able to pivot into a little bit about the composition of this movement now, that's actually a nice pivot because that last line stands a little bit from the rest. If you look at how that actually sounds in Egyptian, well, we have Kheri se mamau, resh kwa amenu neferu. And for the most part, we don't know those words, but a lot of us actually have a relationship to the word neferu because of the queen Nefertiti, who was one of the emperors of, or pharaohs rather, of ancient Egypt at a point. And so that root, nefer, actually means beautiful. So these are beautiful trees of the afterlife. And if you listen to the music, the way I composed it, most of the piece is mysterious at the least, terribly dissonant at the worst. There's a lot of uncertainty in the text up to that point. You know, it's things that they're hoping to have in the overlife, or the afterlife rather. And so if you really look at the harmonic material, it's very octatonic. And I won't go too much into that, but it's a dissonant scale. And then a lot of what's happening in the piano is a counterpoint to what's happening in the singer, who actually starts the piece alone. But it's a dissonant counterpoint. It almost always takes place a tritone away, which is considered the most dissonant interval. And so you get this dissonant music through most of the piece until that very last line when you're in this peaceful field. And at that point, instead of dealing with the octatonic scale, I move to the Dorian scale, which is a much more peaceful sounding scale. And I think it signifies that, yes, the singer or speaker or teller of the story has ended up where they intended to through all of their earthly efforts.
Cool. Nate, did you want to go into a little bit of the your sort of vision for this music video for this movement?
Yeah, sure. So I took this when we did this. I had heard Maddie sing every single bit of it beforehand, and I really went through the score with her to kind of understand where the cycle as a whole was going. You know, and these 3 songs are basically a cycle from death and the afterlife through new life to a celebration of life. And I kind of tried to translate that on screen. So at the beginning of this piece, we sort of start in a dark room lit only by candle, right? And this comes back in the next piece. Like, we start in a very similar sense when the mother is teetering on the brink of life and death. But to me, the sort of darkness is how I represent the afterlife, or in between the worlds in some ways. And this is almost a reminiscing on life, to my ear at least. And through the dissonance that Dr. Roberts talked about, it has an almost ethereal quality, not quite something you traditionally hear. So it's a little alien to the human ear in some ways. So I kind of wanted to translate that on screen with the setup of the picture, and having candles at different levels surrounding Maddie. We also cut in with pictures of Maddie being outside to show memories and, like, sort of the idea of moments before you die, or your last moments, your fond memories. Altogether, it kind of runs back together and forms a cohesive whole that starts the song cycle. I don't think any of these songs should really be taken separately from the song cycle. I think the way that I've filmed them is best taken when watched as a whole.
Awesome. Yes, these are very, very great. I lack English at this moment, but we're going to take a moment and actually listen to this movement. If you're listening or watching on YouTube, you're going to be able to see the video. You're going to be able to see what Nate was just talking about. But regardless, wherever you're listening, you'll be able to hear the beautiful music. So let's take a sec and listen to movement 1. All right, we're back, and let's talk about movement 2, Anka Ankes. As I talked to Maddie about a few minutes ago, the sort of general understanding I have of this piece, and as Nate was kind of saying before, pretty much everybody died all the time in ancient Egypt. You weren't expected to live very long, and especially in childbirth, things got very dangerous very quickly. And so if a child and a mother were to survive childbirth, it was an extremely big deal. And so let's talk about that a little bit in the discussion of Movement 2. Whoever wants to start, I guess Maddie, since I just talked about your little part.
Sure. You kind of covered it. I mean, I have little notes here, but basically the mortality rate in ancient Egypt, like you said, was pretty low. People usually lived from ages 30 to 35 years old. This was due to infection and the unsanitary living conditions of the fact that they just didn't wash, and it was just sand everywhere in their food. It would cause, they would get in their food and they would chew that, and it would cause like actual, I read that from a Karakuni book, I'm sorry. But the infant death rates were even higher. They were illness prone until age 19, and it was very unlikely that a baby could live through childbirth, let alone the mother. Pregnancy, childbirth, and infancy were some of the most dangerous times in ancient Egyptian life.
They also had to look out for chariots.
Apparently chariots too,
Right.
when those became a thing. But failed pregnancies and childbirths were blamed on demons or malicious forces, and they had gods to protect them from these forces. So they had gods like Taweret, Hathor was the big one. They had Sekhmet, Bes. They had Isis. They had plenty of other ones, I'm sure. They have hundreds of gods. But those are the main names. Hathor being the biggest one, but they would have little shrines set up in their little homes because they weren't allowed to go to temples. Most priests weren't allowed to in temples even because of it's just how it was. So they would set up little shrines in their home to worship these gods and to pray that demons would protect them, gods would protect them from demons, excuse me. There would also be times that occasionally during childbirth, if a mother felt like she was in danger, she would just say that she was a goddess and she was Hathor, and that would frighten a demon away. So, yeah. And then if a childbirth was successful, the child was regarded as Horus' child, and the mother was Hathor or Isis. And for those that don't know who Horus is, Horus was he was basically the king of the gods. All pharaohs that are in Egypt or exist were regarded as Horus or blood of Horus. Each pharaoh also got a name that is their Horus name because of their connection to that deity. And then the only other note that I have is about the really awesome harp at the beginning of the piece, which Dr. Roberts is going to talk about in just a second. I think that's a great segue. So, to Phil.
So, a lot of us have heard the term the Egyptian harp before, and we think Egyptian music, we oftentimes think of flutes and we think of harps. The thing is, we actually know what Egyptian harps were tuned to. And that is a fact that I used in the composition of this piece. Now, the other thing, before I go into that Egyptians had in their music was singing. And I'm talking about ancient Egypt, of course, but there's singing in modern Egyptian music as well. However, in ancient Egypt, it was called the art of making music with the hands to sing. And so that's an interesting fact, I thought, since this is a piece for voice. And you might notice some of this when you're watching the song cycle, some hand gestures and such. But there were actually, in ancient Egypt, very specific hand gestures associated with each of these pitches that their harps were tuned to as well. So if you ever see a painting in any Egyptian ruins or anything like that, and you see what looks like a group of musicians, and you see some people that are sitting there like this, those are the singers. Okay, the gesture, for those of you listening, is usually the hands raised up in sort of supplication or something like that. So this scale, the Egyptian scale, is called the Egyptian enharmonic, but that was labeled by the Greeks, so I don't know what the Egyptians called it. It's a 5-note scale, and it actually is very similar to an ancient Japanese scale as well. And you can think of it as the notes A, B, C, E, and F. And then you'd come back to A again. So it's almost like a pentatonic scale, but it's not the minor pentatonic scale. If I were to sing it, and I don't have perfect pitch, so forgive these pitches, it would be something like da 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 are the pitches. And this is what harps were known to be tuned to, and we know this because the Greeks recorded it. Not on like audio tapes or anything, but they wrote this down, okay? And what's weird is the Greeks, when they were the ruling deity, not deities, when they were the ruling dynasty in Egypt for a while, the Ptolemy dynasty, of which Cleopatra was a part, for example, they updated this scale, and they didn't fill in the glaring major thirds that this scale leaves. They filled in the half steps with quarter tones. So the resultant scale was actually da 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 da. They filled it in with quarter tones. And so I use this scale in the middle movement, and the A section, and when that comes back at the end, are exclusively written in this 5-note Egyptian scale that was used back then. And in order to approximate the quarter tones, I have the singer singing portamenti in between the half steps. So you're technically hearing those little quarter tones in between when you're hearing these portamenti, because the portamento is when you slide from one note to the other and you hear all the notes in between. And Maddie does a really great job of bringing those out in the recording. And the other element of this is that to almost emulate the sound of a harp, I have the pianist stand up and strum the chords at the opening of the piece inside of the piano. And to do that, you have to do some preparation beforehand, right? These 5 notes have to be held down on the piano somehow so that those are the only ones you hear when you strum like a harp. And that's something that you'll hear when we listen to the piece. Other than that, there's a little bit of intervallic expansion going on. You know, I said we start with the quarter tones. It ends up building outwards to seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, until sevenths, but all within that mode that we're talking about.
Awesome,
Going off
Nate.
what Dr. Roberts was saying about building up, I feel like a lot of this piece in particular, and how I filmed it, I really started with slow shots to parallel the sort of slow tempo of the piece. But it starts slow and builds. It builds faster and faster into almost a more fevered celebration of living and creating new life, you know. And it's both paralleled in how fast notes, like the rate of the notes, how fast they're coming, and in the size of leaps that are occurring as well. So this is the first piece that we really started sitting outside for a while. It's also the last piece I actually completed for this song cycle, because it took us a couple of times to really get out to the beach to film this correctly. Because
it got dark very quickly.
It got dark very quickly, and weather was not cooperative on another day. We went to film. So we filmed this on the beach where Maddie was actually raised. So it has a little bit of significance in that way. For both of us. But I start the piece with water, because I feel like water is such an important part of an Egyptian's life, and it's a really universal symbol for life across human culture.
Can I say something off of that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just from a mythological standpoint, water is also where life came from in Egypt. It's believed that, well, if we're going to go from a Heliopolis creation myth standpoint, water was like, the sky is like an endless ocean, and the god Nun and Naunet, or that's more Hermopolis kind of, but anyway, Nun was the original everything, and he was the infinite water in the sky. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to interject.
That's interesting.
Continue, Nate.
We love that fact. Good fact.
I'm sorry.
So at the start of this, the way I ended up filming in the same sort of location as the first song, in the dark, surrounded by candles. This time we add a bowl full of water that Maddie is tapping to create ripple reflections of water on her face, to kind of show her almost ethereal state in between life and death at the moment, you know? And as the mother realizes that she's lived, the child's lived, and her strength is coming back to her, we gradually move outside. Especially for like the words, I believe we move out on Anechem Taui, which means to you making, hail thou who makes pleasant the world with chefa food, and with the blue sky. So we transition from this dark, warm scene to a scene shot out close to the golden hour, surrounded by the blue sky and the deep blue of the ocean, you know? Maddie wears a blue dress for this. So this blue expanse is ever present in every shot of this, you know? And I try to layer shots coming faster and faster to coincide with the augmentation in the intervals that Phil described, and also the picking up of the rhythm, especially like when it starts to get a little funky in the rhythm with the 7/8 sections where it adds in those 7/8 measures. Mm-hmm. This is the longest piece, and it feels like it, but it to me, I was going for a nice balance between long shots and shots with movement and shots that cut to movement, you know? And I think by the end of it, we come back down. We settle down again towards the end of this work. Back into the original words, you know? I live, it liveth. The euphoria of the moment of realization has begun to wane a bit, but we end in a very resolved and peaceful way, back with the waters of life.
Beautifully said.
Awesome. Very. I agree. All right. So once again, we're going to take a moment to listen to / watch this movement. As Nate said, it's the longest one, but you're going to want to stick around and see the whole thing because it's great. So we'll be back in a moment to talk about movement 3. All right, so the final movement, Emaka, is a celebratory piece. It's about a flood, and that's about as much as I remember. So, Maddie, why don't you explain it in good words?
So I actually learned the most while I was researching this piece. I thought it was extraordinarily interesting because the first line in this piece is, "It is I who brings the flood, it is I, Toth," or Tehuti, whichever name you prefer. There's like 200 names for every one god. But I was very confused by this because Toth is the god of wisdom, scribes. He's the one that he gambles with the moon to bring an extra 5 days to the year. He's a god of trickery. He is a god of writing. He's a god of... He wrote the Book of the Dead. I didn't see how he was connected to the water. I'm like, where does that come from? And then I learned that every month of the flood, or the Nile's flood, is named after a god. And the first month is named after Toth, and this is because he created the calendar, or in their mythology he did. So the first month is called Toth. So the flood comes because of Toth. But let's talk about the inundation for a little bit. So the Nile is the Nile's flooding comes from the Ethiopian highlands and comes from like monsoons, flooding that happens up there, and it floods downward up to the Nile Delta into the Mediterranean. This flooding happens like July-ish, and it's called Achet. That is when that kind of like season is for them. There's 3 seasons. That's the inundation, and it's from July to August. The next one is called Peret. That's roughly September to January-ish, and that's where they start planting crops. Because after the waters recede from the flood, the Nile has brought silt with it, with all that flooding. So that has made the land around the Nile fertile for growing crops. So that's when all the people will start growing crops. And then Shemu is October to May, and that's when they reap the crops and get all the food that they need from all their little plants. And then the cycle returns when they notice the star Orion in the sky, specifically the Sothis, I can speak, I'm so sorry, or the dog star, which is part of Orion. And when this occurred, there would be festivals and excitement and hullabaloo. They think that something that would happen is that in the temples, they would take the gods out on their little god barks. So the high priests there's a statue of the cult god for every city. In every temple, they would take the statue and put it into this little bark, and they'd take it out so that people could see it, and it would answer yes or no questions by tilting up or down. It was wild, and there was food and music and dancing and lots of musicians, lots of food. It was a good time.
So in other words, the flood wasn't something that they were scared of. It was something they were happy about because it brought
that is the takeaway, yes. That is correct.
Yeah.
Of course, you don't want to sit too close to the flood because you will get destroyed. I mean, there were cities that definitely lost a lot of I mean, there were cities that collapsed because of being either too close or too far away from the Nile. But yeah, the flood overall was something that was phenomenal and great and brought food and brought excitement and life and renewal. So, yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, the movement, I would say, tries to capture a little bit of that spirit of celebration. It's certainly the most rhythmic, defined movement that we have, very forward moving. But it also has a little bit of sense of fear in there, because it wasn't fear that they were necessarily going to be flooded, because most of the cities were built to prevent that, but it was just an awe of what the gods had brought to them. And so, musically speaking, I want to point out an interesting thing that I think about when I'm writing music on texts from another culture that I hadn't necessarily been brought up in myself, but the ancient Egyptian culture, none of us that alive today have been brought up in. It's a culture, it's a sort of a shared heritage for the world. When you're doing something from a culture like that, you want to be mainly your own voice, but also a researched interpreter. And so if you were to pick out a movie from the 1940s or 50s, Land of the Pharaohs or the Ten Commandments that take place in ancient Egypt, and listen to the soundtrack, actually, those soundtracks, while very epic and they can be really good music, a lot of them came from a less informed perspective as far as the history, and they actually went for music that reflects Moorish culture or Arabian culture, which is also a very interesting culture, but it wasn't an ancient Egyptian sound. And so in order to not mismatch cultures or to assume things about this ancient society that I didn't already know, other than, of course, the scale I used in the middle movement, well, I just wrote music that came from my own harmonic language, my own musical language, and that I felt brought in the meaning of the text. So actually, if you listen to the first movement that we talked about, the closest approximation might be Bartok. And this third movement, the closest approximation would probably be Stravinsky, honestly, as influences on the actual musical language. The second movement, because I actually know of a 5-note scale that came from this ancient Egyptian culture, I was able to use it, but I wasn't going to misattribute another culture's music to represent something that it wasn't. So I talk about that now because otherwise this movement's just a lot of fun. And if you listen to kind of like the bass line, this is probably the closest thing to a boom chick kind of riff, which I always, when you hear that in a lot of music, it can be like, oh, this is, dun 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 dun. But in this case, I tried to throw that off kilter a little bit, and you'll hear the bass line shift around, downbeat, offbeat, stuff like that. I just had fun with it, so I hope you enjoy listening to it.
Visually, this one is distinct from the other two because it has no shots from indoors. It was entirely shot outside. This is also to give precedence to this, idea of celebration. They feared the Nile, but it was not a bringer of death in most cases. In fact, it was the reason Egypt was so prosperous was because the Nile flooded every year. That was the reason they became the breadbasket of the ancient world. The reason why Rome wanted that. Rome wanted Egypt. Why ancient Greece, ancient Macedon wanted Egypt was because it was such a producer of grain. So for me, this is a joyful song. It's the most up-tempo. When we performed it, I personally like the middle song the most out of these three. But when we performed this out, it's almost, I'd say, the most accessible of the songs in this cycle. I just shot shots that reflected the simple joyfulness of this work.
Awesome. I think I want to say it's also the shortest as well, just by a small margin compared to the first. So, therefore, let's go ahead and take a watch and a listen of that one, and we'll be back to sort of close out. All right, so I want to say a huge thank you to Maddie, Nate, and Phil for being on today's episode. This project is insanely cool. I have never encountered music in ancient Egyptian before, so it was definitely very refreshing to see something different, and it's very well done on all parts. I understand that you guys have another project in the works, an opera called Madeline Usher. So I'd like to give you guys an opportunity to kind of talk about that, because there will most likely be a reprise of this podcast, Gang, once that is released. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, thanks for the plug. I find it cool because this Madeline Usher that we're working on now is more of a chamber opera, so it's not that long. It's maybe about 20 minutes, even less, but it's based on the material from The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. But it takes the spin of, what if the notoriously silent female character from the original Edgar Allan Poe work actually had all of the arias? And so that role is what's being played by Maddie, that role of Madeline Usher. And the role of... yeah, go ahead, Nate. The role of Roderick will be played by Nate. So why don't you say something about that?
Well, I will no longer be playing a silent character as the cameraman in this one. I will actually be singing the role of Roderick, who is Madeline's brother in this one.
Awesome. And what sort of... how are we going to see this project or hear it? Like, what format are we going to have this in?
So this will be an audio project only, because we are shooting with a tenor from Turkey named Çınar. So there is no feasible way for us to film this in any conceivable way.
You mean you're
so
not just going to hop on a plane and go to Turkey?
Yeah, especially with all the COVID stuff.
In the middle of the pandemic? What are you talking about?
Right. No, so this one was a primarily audio project. But awesome. We hope you guys enjoy it all the same.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's,
right.
It's great to be able to participate, since you mentioned the pandemic, to participate in making music, and I am ever appreciative to these two vocalists for interpreting my music, and thank you, Carrie, for having us on the show.
It was my pleasure. I was very excited to do this kind of different style of episode today. I enjoyed hearing all of your perspectives. I think, viewers, that we are incredibly lucky here today, because we've got three very different artistic perspectives on the same work. So we've got, the history and the visual art and the music. So that's really special. And when you can sort of interpret a piece in those three different ways, that's a really holistic kind of really thorough way to take in a work. So I hope everyone enjoyed it. We're going to listen to a little bit more of the piece that we heard at the beginning of today's episode, and then I'm going to come back to close it out in our outro. So we're going to say bye to our guests. Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, you're welcome. And we'll be back in a few seconds.
Until next time.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed the project featured today and that you have learned a lot about all aspects of it. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Chopin's Etude No. 6 in G minor, performed by Randolph Hokanson and published by Pandora Records. We would like to thank him for graciously allowing the use of his recording in this podcast. We would also like to thank Nate Wilkins, Maddie Fitzpatrick, and Dr. Phil Roberts for not only appearing on today's episode, but for allowing the use of their audio and video recordings in its production. Once again, we hope you have enjoyed this episode. My name is Carrie Sullivan, and this has been Maneuvering Music at Miami University.